Dr. Joe Trotter, who is a professor of history at Carnegie Mellon University. And so Dr. Trotter's bio is printed in the program, and the complete bio can be found on our website, on our conference website. So I'm going to go ahead and bring Dr. Trotter up. And Dr. Trotter is going to give us a historical perspective on the pandemic and its impact on several housing and other areas that are significant to communities of color. So Dr. Trotter, would you please come?
Okay.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Gwendolyn. And thanks to everybody. I'm so excited to be here for this conference. And also just excited to just be a part of this book that will be released, I guess, pretty soon. People can pick it up and really learn from these essays. And so today, I just want to give you sort of a flavor of the essay that I contributed to that volume. But before I get started, I do want to say a few things about gratitude, a little bit more about gratitude. By the way, my chapter in the book is titled Labor History and Pandemic Response, the Overlapping Experiences of Work, Housing, and Neighborhood Conditions. One of the things you may want to keep in mind is that you're looking at a labor, urban, and social historian, African-American historian. I was just delighted to be in the company of so many people who work on the policy issue today, working on the ground, trying to change conditions now. So much of my work is about trying to understand how current conditions are a product of our history. And so part of what this chapter will try to do is to illuminate some of that. Okay. But look, Gwendolyn has given me some marching orders that historians can be long-winded and maybe talk too long and deprive our audience of an opportunity to raise questions and even to comment. And so what I want to do today is to talk to you about this chapter. I'm not going to read the chapter. You'll be able to do that when the book comes out. But I do want to just thank Gwendolyn, Lucas Hubbard, and William Darity again. This book, and you'll see right there, let me say another couple of things, and then I'll go forward. I want to thank Madeline Braxick and Kimberly Domowitz, and you, the audience, for being here. You guys have all helped to make my presence on this stage possible, so I want to thank you for that. But in order to really take advantage of the time that we have together today on the historical part, I want to just give you first an overview of what this chapter that I wrote is all about. And so that when Gwen says you've said enough, I want you to at least know what I'm trying to convey in the book. And so you'll see here I've created an outline that tries to capture some of the major dimensions of what I'm trying to do. And I guess one of the first things is this genesis of the chapter. Where did this chapter come from? And again, I have to turn to William Darity, Gwendolyn Wright, and Lucas Hubbard. When I got a call from Gwen and Sandy about putting together a volume on the African-American experience during the COVID era. And it was in May, like in May 2020, and it was astounding to me to hear people right in the eye of the storm, and they're thinking about how to get us out of that storm and how to really produce scholarship that will illuminate an issue that is so pressing to all of us at that moment. So I was very impressed by that. And so part of this chapter is a product of that contact that they made with me as a historian, and I felt honored. to be asked to add a historical dimension to this project. But you know, the genesis of this chapter had another piece. Many of you will recall that when the COVID-19 initially hit, there was a lot of information or conversation on social media about how black people were not likely to be affected by the pandemic. And it was kind of a racialized argument about black people as Africans and sort of our genetic makeup, that COVID was going to pass over us. That was some disturbing discussion. And pretty soon, you know, it died down because the evidence came forward so quickly that not only were black people dying and suffering from the pandemic, they were dying and suffering in greater numbers than others, particularly the white community. And so it was important that people get on board with the idea that black people are involved in this disaster, you know, this tragedy that was COVID, that black people were being affected. But pretty soon, if you think about that moment when we were talking about COVID, right in the moment of COVID's acceleration, people start asking, then why? You know, then why are black people so disproportionately impacted? And we started to get some pretty serious conversation about why black people suffered more. This notion of pre-existing conditions became part of the rhetoric of the period. And a lot of professional medical people got involved and started to talk about the way, and you're going to have an essay in the book. There's an essay in the book already. I think, Sandy, you referenced that essay. There's a pre-existing, conditions essay in the volume, and I've read it, and I've started to learn more, about these things. But diabetes, low-wage job, lack of insurance, poor access to medical care, all those pre-existing conditions and working conditions that black had were things that exposed black people disproportionately to the pandemic. And so part of my chapter is responding, to some of these issues, responding. And when we look back at the conversation, there's another dimension to it that for historians is very important. And that is, before long, it was good to hear in the popular media people saying things, but this pandemic is not altogether new. That we have to remember that African Americans have historically suffered disproportionately, whatever the conditions were. And so there was an attempt to really bring the history of slavery into the conversation, the history of black people during the Jim Crow era into the conversation, as well as trying to understand the post-industrial moment in which COVID hit. That's another era in black history. And so we have to put also these different moments in black history, and we have to find ways to link up the connections and the way that each of these moments sort of fuel inequalities at the next moment. And so that was another item that I was interested in. But what really fueled my writing and thinking about the chapter was this issue of, yes, there is a historical dimension to this, but how seriously are we taking the historical dimension? And so I started to see that in some of this conversation, people felt that it was enough to say, oh yeah, slavery, oh yeah, Jim Crow. And then they go on to talking about other things. But as a historian, I believe we have to be committed to uncovering the concrete realities of these earlier moments, uncovering what it meant to be enslaved and suffering from certain diseases during that period, what it meant to be part of a great migration and entering the industrial system for the first time in large numbers and sort of leaving the sharecropping legacy behind. What did it mean and what kinds of new inequalities emerge out of this new moment. And we can talk about the Great Migration all day, about it wasn't just doom and gloom, right? There was a hopeful dimension to the migration. Black people were making decisions about changing their lives, but there was still this element of health disparities embedded in the industrial system. And so my essay is trying to say, let's take a closer look at some of these things, see just what that meant. And so that's the other side of it. So just summarizing, the argument then that I'm making, when I say the principal arguments, there are about 3 pieces to the argument that I make. And one piece of it is what I just said. In order to demonstrate this question about the impact of history on COVID, we have to go back and do some serious uncovering of that history. So that's one of the arguments. The other argument that I make that I think is critical is that we have to look at the American medical profession and to ask questions about how professional medicine was implicated in the inequality that black people face in the healthcare system and in inequality that we face whenever there is a health crisis. The medical profession has to be interrogated and made accountable for a lot. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. But the third dimension is probably most important. The history is important. The white medical profession is important. But what did black people do on their own to help heal themselves? That's the third theme that I try to tease out. Is because too often when we try to show inequalities that black people face, it sometimes drowns out the reality that black people are not just taking these issues sitting down. They are standing up. They are stepping up, trying to build alternative lives, trying to cure themselves in the context of epidemics and pandemics. And so those are the 3 arguments that I tried to make in the book. And then, those arguments, by the way, mean that we have to raise questions and we have to answer them. And so I outlined a few questions that go with those arguments that I want to talk to you about. But in this brief summary, I also want to call your attention to those number 5, 6, and 7 on this outline. Because when we talk about African American history, we just have to acknowledge that black history is a moving phenomenon. It changes, and it can change quickly. And so we have to look at the way slavery gave way, to freedom, emancipation, and then the sharecropping system, and how rural black life gave way to the Great Migration, and the emergence of black people as a predominantly urban people. Black people became the most urban people in the country as a result of the Great Migration. So we want to talk about that. And then there's a piece on here, there's a piece to the story that I didn't include in the chapter, but I'm now trying to expand my understanding of these issues. That post-industrial piece, that piece that deals with what happened to the African American moment of civil rights triumph, where black people demolished Jim Crow. Jim Crow couldn't stand against the onslaught of the civil rights movement. And for a brief moment there, affirmative action, movement toward bringing blacks into the fold and creating opportunities for upward mobility, education, jobs. There was a brief moment there, right after, the heyday of the civil rights movement, There was a lot of hope that things were changing. And then by the late 20th century, things collapsed. And in many ways, you know, the Reagan era, we know about that. We also know that in major industrial cities, manufacturing virtually disappeared. And we know also that black people were disproportionately impacted by all of those things. And so for this this fourth item, the post-industrial period, actually I hope that we'll have a chance to talk about that in the Q&A, you know, to talk about your perspective on that, because I'm trying to get a handle on all of that. And then I want to sum up and conclude with some statements about, at least from my vantage point, where do we go from here, especially on the historical side. And I think Professor Darity has already talked about deepening the policy dimension. And so I want to raise some questions about complementing that, about deepening our understanding of history and forging ahead with more systematic historical research so that we can sort of marry those two dimensions, what's happening today with the way we can understand our past. Okay, so right now, bear with me, this is hard sledding. After I've made my big argument about we have to really get into the history, you just can't invoke history, you have to deal with history. Then I want to give some evidence from these earlier periods in African American history. And then hopefully I'll be able to bring this to a close and we can have conversation together. But that's an overview. That's what I'd like for you to be able to take away from the book, at least my chapter, my contribution to the book. There's a lot more for you to take away from the book. So let's go forward with some evidence. Let me give you some illustrations. I've already said this, the genesis of the chapter, so we can go fast forward through some of this side. I won't repeat all that now, so we'll go forward on all of this on the Genesis question. I've already talked about this, so I won't keep you on this. Okay. Is this working? Okay, there it is. But I do want to just reiterate that this chapter is meant as a historical backdrop to the other essays in the book. And I just want to say this is an extraordinary book. And I'm learning so much from the other articles. Right now I'm trying to build on this essay and write more about the history of African American healthcare. So this book has come at a good time for me. I've already said something about the arguments. We can go through that. I won't repeat all this. I've said enough there. But I do want to reiterate the three major objectives and questions that this chapter tries to answer. Okay. First, how have the labor requirements of work and living conditions shaped the African American encounter with disease over time? That's the first question. Second question, how did the white medical profession, practitioners, and theorists influence the health experiences of black people? That's the second question. Third, and most important, how did people of African descent create and repeatedly rebuild or recreated upon their own legacy of healthcare and healthcare activism? Well, that's the third question. And now I want to turn to some of these questions in the context of enslavement, the industrial period, and emancipation. So let's go with enslavement. You'll see that after surviving the Middle Passage, the horrors of the Middle Passage, 500,000 enslaved Africans disembarked in North America during the transatlantic slave trade. Europeans quickly turned to enslaved African labor to produce a variety of staple crops for international markets, and for profit. The labor requirements of staple production varied from crop to crop, but the work regimen in sugar, rice, tobacco, and cotton, all of these crops required a work regimen that took a huge toll on the health and lives of African people. And so when we look at these different work environments, we can see how there was some variation if you were a rice grower or a tobacco worker. But the great consistency is the way these jobs just rob black people of their health. Okay, now here, take tobacco. And I'd like to call attention to these early crops because the stereotype of black enslavement is cotton. And there are a lot of people in the popular, imagination and mind, they think cotton was king from the beginning in black life, but that's not true. Tobacco, rice, sugar, those were the big ones in the early part of African American life in America. Plantation owners describe the tobacco plant as a very tender plant, but its cultivation, quote, strained every nerve of enslaved workers' bodies. So, that's a health consequence. The greatest health hazard of tobacco production involved lung disease caused by the constant inhalation of tobacco fumes. Tobacco bale unloaders and unpackers bore the brunt of dust inhalation. The dust also irritated the eyes and caused excessive tearing and damage to the sight of tobacco workers. Moreover, when the dust fumes mixed with juice from the tobacco leaves, it caused rashes on the face and the back of hands. All tobacco workers suffered from the constant inhalation of nicotine, including acute poisoning for some workers that resulted in insomnia, nausea, and vomiting. That's tobacco's toll, in part, on black workers. Rice and sugar was even worse. Life, labor, and health challenges were even greater in the lower South, where rice and sugar production predominated during the colonial era. French historian Fernand Braudel compared the labor requirements of rice production with a variety of other crops, and he concluded, quote, rice holds the record for the manhandling it requires. What he meant was man-killing that it required. This is a case where black people were literally worked to death in the rice fields. And here's a popular poem called Carolina or the Planter, George Ogilvy. He compared the establishment and cultivation of rice plantation to the, quote, rechanneling of the Euphrates and the building of the pyramids. In order to construct an extensive network of banks, canals, ditches, and drains, enslaved people regularly removed some 500 cubic yards of river swamp for each acre of rice under cultivation. I don't have a lot of time to go through all these details, but keep in mind, please, that when we talk about black people growing rice, picking cotton, and all these other crops, they weren't just growing the crops and picking cotton, and they were constructing the entire infrastructure that cotton required, that rice cultivation required, before they even picked a grain of cotton or a bowl of cotton. They had to do the work of preparing the land, building buildings, doing all of that preparatory work, and then they would put to work on these projects. I'm going to fast forward here because I want to get through some examples, but here's an example that I want to call your attention to before we move forward. This gives you an indication of the toll on black life that these this work took. An estimated 7,000 Africans arrived in Louisiana, and this is the sugar and rice as well area, in Louisiana between 1718 and 1735, but the resident African population stood at only 3,400 at the end of this period. This was a case in which in South Carolina and also in Louisiana, historians call it a Caribbean pattern of plantation labor, where blacks were literally killed under the impact of this work. Okay, so let's go forward. Rice, sugar did the same thing as rice. Took their lives, heavy work. But here's a quote I do want to call your attention to. These people knew that they were taking it out of black people. But still, look at this quote where this one slave owner talked about 15 enslaved workers were sick with respiratory ailments. One woman had died. And they were reporting on a day-to-day basis to each other about the status of their... And then he said, "Yet I grow fat in spite of heat and fatigue. Well, I mean my own family and self. We're the ones who grow fat, right? But we continue to thank God to enjoy fine health." That really struck me, that this person knew that they were exploiting black labor to the hilt. And they were thanking God that they didn't get sick and that they could still grow fat on the labor of these people. So yeah, so that's striking. So I'm going to go forward. By the 19th century, though, after the American Revolution, cotton did become king, okay? It really became king because economic historians like William Doherty tell us that the U.S. economy could not move without cotton. Cotton fueled not just Southern growth, but Northern industrialization. And so cotton did become king in a way. But here's a piece that I want to just highlight because I know that we don't have time for all the examples. But the whip is symbolic of the way violence and the mistreatment of black bodies was at the very heart of the enslavement of black people in America. And the whip, this violence perpetrated on black people, was extended beyond the field into the quarters and into the neighborhood and into the larger communities of this enslavement period. So we don't have a lot of time to go through that, so I'm going to push forward and talk about some other dimensions. Here's what I want to get to now. Some illustrations about how it wasn't that just black people were being exploited and their health undermined through work, housing, living conditions. It was also true that they weren't getting any help when they got sick, or at least just very little help. And so the medical profession was at issue. It was at fault. And when the medical profession came into being during the late 18th and early 19th centuries, it reinforced the poor health condition that existed among black people. I'm beginning to read more on the history of American medicine, and a lot of these recent studies are just showing us that, look, the American medical profession in a way got its being through the way it incorporated race into its identity. The most fundamental principle for early American medicine and early Western medicine is that blacks and whites were genetically different people. and that black people were genetically inferior, whites genetically superior. And many of the diseases these early physicians said were a product of black innate characteristics. And so medical help can't do very much to change that. And so it led to a kind of callousness on the part of medicine and physicians toward black people. But look, they had to halt a little bit, because after all, these people are sources of wealth, right? And so you want them to be able to have the able-bodied capacity to keep working. So there had to be a modicum of concern about their health. And so balancing that racist medical outlook against the very practical sort of desire to make money off of these people was an issue. We'll talk more about that in conversation. But what I want to point out is the way black people were defined. Are we okay? Can you guys hear me okay? The way black people were defined as almost less than human led to some terrible abuses. So I'd like for you to take a look at this last sentence in this slide, where I point out no other ethnic or racial group suffered the widespread surgical removal of skin as did blacks to satisfy the curiosity of white physicians bent on proving innate differences between black and white people. In a careful study of the voluminous literature of skin color published in Europe between 1675 and 1810, historian Renato Mussolini reported the dissection of some 38 African bodies. Not only were white bodies apparently exempt from these incisions, but not a single, quote, Amerindian or Asian was open for this purpose, end of quote. And so there was a kind of real callousness in dealing with the health and well-being of black people. And I tried to underline a number of examples, and here is one that is astounding. I sort of want to get your reaction to it because some medical professionals may have a different take on some dimensions of this. But here's a case where DuBois Review published an article by a planter and physician talking about how so many black babies were dying from lockjaw. And this is on a Louisiana sugar plantation. And he said that these deaths were caused by the injection of poison contaminated breast milk from their mothers during the first 2 weeks of following birth. And then he said a remedy should be, and this was a remedy tailored toward black women, not white women. The remedy entailed feeding the newborn on sweet oil and molasses as to keep the bowels loose and having the mother's breasts freely drawn and daily emptied of their milk in any one of several ways by the nurse, the midwife, another and older child, or by a puppy. And I put italics on that because I said this is astounding, medical racism. But here's another one that I just found like painful to read. This is a case where a doctor, and see these doctors who were in the backwaters of America, they were practicing in places that were off the main track. They tried their best to create an opportunity to become renowned in the medical world. And in 1857, Dr. John Butts, a Princeton, Mississippi physician, shipped the freshly amputated arm of a 24-year-old female slave to the well-known New Orleans physician, educator, and journalist, Erasmus Darwin Fenner. Enslaved Africans, I want to back up a minute. Yes, the woman's arm arrived at Fenner's office with a detailed case history of the afflicted limb. According to historian Stephen Kenny, the surrender of the arm enabled a backwoods country doctor like Butts to cultivate ties to elite physicians like Fenner and his colleagues at the New Orleans School of Medicine. He was also able to get his name printed in a prestigious professional medical journal, the New Orleans Medical News and Hospital Gazette. He was also able to witness his specimen on display in one of the rising number of medical museums that spread across the antebellum South to help educate aspiring young white doctors. African Americans provided the bulk of these popular exhibits of human body parts. Another case, professional medicine, getting its footing, creating a reputation on the backs of black people. Okay, I'm going to go forward and just say this now, and I know Gwendolyn's going to stop me pretty soon. I'm just going to say a few words about black people. They didn't take this sitting down. They built, and here's the way I put it, enslaved African Americans did not take racist medical science and practices sitting down. Across 18th and early 19th century America, enslaved African people took medical matters into their own hands. They were determined to establish their own healthcare system and break dependence on plantation medicine. They developed a variety of strategies for improving their own health and the health of their families and their communities. Perhaps most important, enslaved people built upon their African medical heritage. They crafted their own brand of care, complete with special remedies, medical practitioners, and rituals. In their groundbreaking book on the medical history of African Americans and the problem of race during and after slavery, medical historian W. Michael Bird and his wife, Linda A. Clayton, document the emergence of this system as early as 1731 to 1812. As they put it, African American healers and medical practitioners were practicing all over America during these years, especially in the South. Most of these practitioners constituted the slave health subsystem of self-trained or informally trained healers, conjurers, root doctors, and slave midwives. Okay. The white medical profession did not like this. They tried their best to stamp out this black self-help medical tradition. But black women, as midwives, and some of the black men doctors, they were so good at what they did that even white physicians and some of the plantation owners grudgingly acknowledged their expertise. And here's an example of Mildred Graves. One plantation midwife later recalled how she was summoned to the bedside of a white woman to assist with a complicated birth. When she arrived, she found two white doctors already at the woman's side. When she told the physicians that she understood the woman's problem and that she could help, they laughed and told her in no uncertain terms to stand back. We mean business and don't want any witch doctors or hoodoo stuff. But the laboring white woman sent the white doctors away and retained Graves to help her with that pregnancy. And Graves helped successfully deliver the woman's child. And we got a lot of stories like this. So I'm going to fast forward. And there are cases where black enslaved people were pressing their owners to let them go to another to a black doctor instead of the plantation doctor. And so, Gwendolyn, where are you? Is she in the room? Okay, come up and flag me, because here's an example that I want to give, and then I'll sum up. Okay. Okay, I'm going to sum up. Look, you guys, a lot of you already know this. The book by Harriet Washington, Medical Apartheid. It talks a lot about the experimentation on black bodies, not only in slavery, but across time. There is a way in which this book by Deidre Cooper Owens, Medical Bondage on Black Women, whereas Washington, I think, sort of underscored, the painful legacy of this experimentation on black women's bodies. Deidre Owens admitted the horrors of these experiments. But then she also said that the sort of underside of this process is that a lot of these slave women became very experienced and knowledgeable gynecologists because they were helping these white doctors perform these operations. And so in her words, here she says, according to Owens, following recuperation from surgery, the women Sims operated, and by the way, this doctor, let me see if I'm finding his name, Dr. James Marion Sims, some of you know this as a popular doctor who had a statue put up in his honor somewhere in the Northeast. And once they started researching what he did to black slave women, they tried to dismantle this. And I think they may have succeeded. But anyhow, I'll go forward. Cooper Owens argued that these enslaved women helped to give birth to the new medical field of gynecology. In her view, enslaved women knew more about the repair of these obstetrical issues that women had than most American doctors during the mid to late 1840s. And then she redefined that hospital that was used for all these experiments in a way. She said they helped to establish and run the first women's hospital in the United States between 1844 and 1849. This is astounding reinterpretation, or another sort of piece of an interpretation showing how black people were not simply victims always, and that they could turn their victimization into some sort of victory in some ways, which is, I think, something that we are used to acknowledging, in African American experience. Okay, I'm going to fast forward and summarize quickly here. Emancipation brought another set of challenges for black people in terms of the work that they were able to do, in terms of their access to the white medical profession. There were new challenges. But in this period, in the essay, I try to make the point that the old root doctors and traditional black medical help came under attack in the period after the Civil War, even from a rising group of black professional physicians and nurses. And so this old medical system, people who were midwives and healers, folk healers, they face a declining experience with this professional black medical profession coming into being. And these hospitals and nursing schools, this is the period in which black people rebuilt their system, but they rebuilt it on the basis of a professionalization of the black health experience. Okay, I'm going to fast forward, and then I'm going to conclude so we can talk a little bit. And by the way, the Freedmen's Bureau did a lot of good. It established some hospitals. It helped black people with food, shelter, and so on. But the Freedmen's Bureau had a blind spot on racial perspectives on black medical care. And I'm going to give this example Between 1862 and 1868, when a smallpox epidemic broke out across the South and took the lives of thousands of African Americans, the medical division of the Freedmen's Bureau failed to institute effective measures to contain the virus among formerly enslaved people. Instead, Bureau officials believed that the high mortality rate of blacks from the disease confirmed their inferiority as a people and was a sure sign of the impending extinction of the black race. And so they were negligent and didn't allot funds and resources for doctors to deal with that smallpox. And so that's why I call this era an era of mixed blessings for African Americans. And I'm going to fast forward. Oh, and by the way, TB just took off, right? In this period of Jim Crow, TB just took off. Black TB rates rose 3 times as high white TB rate. And also until 1900, TB was considered by the professional medical experts as a black disease. But then white people started contracting TB, and then all of a sudden they redefined black people as carriers of the disease and white people as victims of the disease, which was a racialization of an issue that cut across racial lines. It's just amazing. Okay. So I'm going forward. Okay. Fast forward to the industrial period, the Great Migration. I'm not going to say much about it, but I summarized it. And then the post-industrial. And here I just want to bring it to a close, and then we can talk more about what happened later. In sum, in order to better understand the impact of COVID-19, this essay that I contributed suggests that we need to make more explicit connections between the past and present. First, we need more on the interrelationship between labor requirements of work, living conditions, and the African American encounter with disease at different points in time. I want to call for that. Second, we need to continue to examine precisely how the white medical establishment influenced the African American quest for health and well-being in particular places and times. Three, we need to explore in ever greater detail how people of African descent created and repeatedly recreated their own legacy of healthcare and healthcare activism. And I believe this is a thread that runs through all these periods. Fourth, we need to seek to craft, and notice I put this in bold, need to seek to craft a succinct, popular, and accessible history, a synthesis of African American labor, health, and healthcare from the early onset of enslavement to COVID-19. I believe that the pandemic divide, how COVID-19 increased inequality in America, offers a solid foundation for attempting such a volume. Perhaps a new book series that the Cook Center might open up that builds on the pandemic divide would also encourage the next generation of scholarship on the interplay of work, history, health, and the quest for medical equality and democracy. So that's it. Thank you.
Questions?
Thank you so much for the wonderful historical analysis. You may have referenced it or not. I was hoping you could also speak to the Tuskegee study somewhere as one of the a more recent occurrence of how African Americans of low incomes were enticed for a study without consent, leading to a lot of suffering. Thank you.
Okay. Let me just. I'm going to walk around just a little bit. Would you just repeat that again for me?
Okay. In your analysis that I was following, I was looking at a more recent historical occurrence in the African American community,
Yes.
whereby the Tuskegee study also focused on African Americans of low income and subjected them to syphilis infection
Right.
for some of the unethical studies in the medical history of
Right.
this country.
Yeah, you mean the low income people? Yeah, this argument about black people being able to, to shape their own medical history, I think is related to this question of class, as well. And so I think this is an important question that we need to explore. And I would just add that when we get to the point of changes in the folk medicine tradition, it's poor and working class blacks continue to follow through with some of those traditions, even as this professional medical class comes to the fore and has such a great influence on creating these hospitals and nursing schools. And so there is a class dimension to that. And I'm interested in learning more about how this, this plays out. Don't know if that answers your question. Okay. All right.
Interesting presentation. I was wondering if any of the current health issues of descendants of slaves are related to where their ancestors were slaves and what kind of crops they were working in.
Oh, that's a very good question. And I think it's a question that's worth examining. I'm not a medical historian, and I'm just beginning to really make the connection between this kind of work that I do, and I think that's one that's worth investigating. I do have a colleague at Carnegie Mellon who is an African historian who is working on rice plantations in the, the South Carolina area. And I think that some of the work that she is doing is suggesting that there is some continuity in terms of the health vulnerabilities and so on in that area. Because she's worked on the rice fields in West Africa, and now she's doing work on South Carolina to try to draw some parallels. So I think that's an excellent question. I would like to see more done on that. Thank you.
Yeah, now I figure out how it works.
Okay.
I'm very glad you mentioned the case of Marion Sims, because that's a very complicated story, which I don't think anybody has gotten to the bottom of. And I think your story about the fact that he worked with women is lost, and there's a tremendous opportunity in terms of doing that. And his statue was on the Museum Mile in New York City.
Yeah.
And I walked across that statue 10 years ago, and my sister, who's a historian of New York City architecture, I said, man, that's an amazing story.
Yeah.
There's an opportunity to bring that statue back. And I had this vision of him standing in confrontation with the women that he treated.
Oh, I
because
see.
he learned from them,
Yeah.
and he was a complicated figure.
Mm-hmm.
And he got him, he was a Southerner. He freed all his slaves. He did some very questionable things,
Yeah.
but he also did them on white women.
Yeah,
And then he got into trouble with that. But
Yeah.
he clearly learned from those women that he worked with.
Yeah.
And he remembered them with affection in his writings.
Okay.
And he was actually written about in the National Medical Association Journal as
Okay.
one of those people during the slave era who was progressive. And I found, that has been lost in that debate.
Yeah.
There's an opportunity to then bring the whole story in.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that question. Yes, there's a lot of dimensions to this story. But I think that the fact that these were Irish women, that he were mostly...
No, he was asked by slave owners to take care of these women.
Yeah, I know.
And he...
I was talking about when he moved north.
Yes,
When,
well,
then,
other
what,
provinces in North.
yeah.
I know less about that.
Okay, I thought...
He's a major figure because he founded Sloan Kettering.
Yeah, yeah.
And he founded, women's
Yeah.
across the street from Columbia University.
Yeah.
And one has to tell the complexity of these stories. One can't
Yeah.
just erase the fact that these prejudices were done
Yeah.
and say we forgot about it.
Yeah.
The same people who put up a statue were the ones who wanted it removed.
Okay.
You know?
Okay.
There's a hypocrisy there.
Okay. All right. Very, very well taken. Very well taken. Thank you. Okay.
Good morning, Dr. Trotter. I just want to thank you for an illuminating
Thank you.
presentation.
Okay.
That was very good. I wanted to address the gentleman's question about the study at Tuskegee. The men that were participants in that study
Okay.
were not infected by the researchers. They already had syphilis.
Okay.
They were untreated.
Okay.
And so they studied these individuals
Okay.
to see the progression of syphilis in that
Okay.
population without giving them treatment. And even after treatment became available, they still
Yeah.
were not given the treatment. And so that was the horrors of that study and
Okay.
how they had used African Americans to progress their own studies and profession and research. We
Okay.
have some Tuskegee people here. If they could stand up, Dr. Vivian Carter and one of her students is here.
Oh, very good. Thank you.
And I'm also a graduate of Tuskegee and have worked there, but I just want people to understand that a lot of the work and what we know about healthcare and the things and atrocities that have been plagued upon African Americans, a lot of that work was done at Tuskegee. And so I
Yeah.
thank you for bringing us
Yeah.
here
Thank you.
and to
Yeah.
share that with us.
And thanks for returning to that question too, because I know I, sort of passed over some of that. Okay.
Okay, we're going to have a couple more questions.
Professor
Oh, yes,
Trotter, thank you so much for your presentation.
Okay.
I guess one of the things that I'd love you to be able to just shed a light on, two things that you had mentioned.
Okay.
You mentioned about the momentum that was present at the time of the civil rights movement. And I think you mentioned coming back to that, talking about that, and I wondered if you could share a little bit more your perspective, your understanding about what really generated that momentum, how it could be sustained in terms of really being able to change these pre-existing conditions for people of color, for black people. And the reason why I say that is that even as you share historically what has happened to black people in America, I feel as if we are always looking at just refined versions of the same thing. So what we saw in enslavement, what we're seeing now in the pandemic, is really a refined version of the same thing. And unless you're able to really change those pre-existing conditions,
Yeah.
Professor Doherty spoke about
Yeah.
the reparations.
Yeah.
If we're not able to become an economically and viable part of the society, kind of bridging that gaps between blacks and white,
Yes.
what we're basically doing is we're speaking about really the same thing, but just a refined version of it.
Yes.
And so I
yeah.
just wondered if you could share a little bit about this momentum that, for the civil rights of African Americans, and now this momentum that needs to happen around the issue of reparations
Yeah.
and putting black people in a financial position so that
Okay.
we're not a part of this conversation of, our working conditions or health. I hope I'm expressing
Yeah.
myself
No,
correctly.
very good. No, you're raising a challenging question, and I'm happy I'm in the room with the people on this Pandemic Divide book chapter, because they are working on just these issues of policy and change. For me, one of the things I think we have to keep in mind for the civil rights movement era is the way in which struggle and successes they can change, and they can change pretty quickly. You know, you have a grassroots movement, you bring about change, and then you have this resistance. And the resistance never go away. And I think that one part of the challenge is always being able to manage, you know, this resistance to change that black people encounter. And white resistance has been a major part of that. But then the other side of it is that in order to affect fundamental change, there has to be alliances, you know, built between African Americans who want social justice and whites who desire social justice, so you can create a cohesive movement. And I think that's one of the challenges that we face. And I think embedded in an earlier question was the class challenge, because black people are now, you know, there are some serious divisions, you know, between the actual experiences of African Americans at different levels, you know, of the class structure, and the capacity to build alliances that truly help poor and working class people can sometimes run up against a certain form of resistance from people who may be better situated. And so it's a real challenge. And I like the reparations movement. I've always felt that part of my research, while not explicitly, you know, making that point, has been making a case for reparations all along. You know, the terrible conditions, the exploitation. We've been making that. But now, I think, making the transition from making the case to a transition of making a policy recommendation that will stick, that's where we are now. And I think that that's part of the challenge. So your question is a good one. I don't have the good answers, so I'm going to invite others of my colleagues to help chime in on this question. And by the way, we are working on that question at Carnegie Mellon. I am part of a project that Earl Lewis, who is at the University of Michigan, a 10-site project on reparations and the university. You know, and so they're a 3-year project funded by the A.W. Mellon Foundation, enabling us to research this issue in the context of different cities, you know, around the country. And we're looking at Pittsburgh. And Pittsburgh is a very complicated picture in some ways because unlike so many other cities, Pittsburgh has this sort of core urban-based population, you know, the Hill District. But then across the city, there are other separate communities, East Liberty, Homewood, Rushton, Manchester on the north side. So you have to bridge, you know, those different communities. And on top of that, Pittsburgh is situated in western Pennsylvania, and a lot of black people live in those declining mill towns, you know, that the mill towns like Braddock, Duquesne, Homestead. And so there is a challenge trying to really create a case for reparations that cut across all these communities, because in many ways, communities often identify themselves in ways that's pretty specific, you know, to their locale. And so trying to really tease out those commonalities and coming up with a composite consensus on a reparations program is a challenge. So you are right, we need to keep working on it and do our best.
We have a quick question and a quick answer. So we have one question, and so you and Dr. Trotter can.
Okay.
Quick question, quick answer.
Okay.
I will try to make
Where's
this quick.
the quick question?
Thank you, Dr. Trotter, for your presentation. I just had a quick question about the housing conditions and neighborhood conditions of Black Americans throughout history as well as in the pandemic, and how that has affected the inequities that have occurred during the COVID-19 pandemic, specifically ongoing now with the lack of affordable housing and how that affects the inequities.
Yes, I liked your question, and you guys noticed that I stuck pretty close to work in this one. I went into the workplace, I didn't come out, but the neighborhood is another issue. And I would just say quickly, since I can give a quick answer, is that the way black neighborhoods are situated and treated, you know, environmentally, you know, like dumping waste and so on, and neglecting, you know, the public, you know, health system, I think those, and also segregation, you know, and discrimination in the way in which black people can gain access to housing. And very often they are only able to gain access as whites exit certain areas that are run down, unsafe, unhealthy. And so, yes, that's a major issue. And so I always like to say that along with these terrible work conditions, there's a parallel neighborhood and housing set of conditions that reinforce those conditions. Now, these workers taking some occupational hazards straight from the workplace into the home. But then at home, there are additional compounded conditions that reinforce, you know, those conditions that they face in their work lives. Okay, all right.
So
Okay,
you can continue
thank you.
to engage with Dr. Trotter. This was a fascinating, informative discussion, and we want to give him a round of applause and thank him.
Thank you.